don't sense anybody's dozing after the last few speakers. What we're going to do now is Dr. Michael Kalichman is going to talk, and he's a nationally known bioethicist, and he's going to give his impressions just as we open the symposium with an ethical discussion of the framework we're going to put things in. We're going to sort of close that with the same notion, and Dr. Kalichman is going to give his impressions of what he's gleaned from this morning in his framework of ethics. Dr. Kalichman is the founding director of the San Diego Research Ethics Consortium. He's an adjunct professor in the Department of Pathology and director of Research Ethics Program at UC San Diego. He's a project director and is NIH funded for research in ethics. He directs NIH-funded projects to assess the effectiveness of teaching research ethics and the standard of conduct in research. He's nationally known in this field. And after his discussion, we'll have 45 minutes to an hour, as long as people want, for panel discussion and Q&A after this. Dr. Kalichman.
Thanks very much. I first want to thank Drs. Rosen and Gupta for the invitation to come today, have the chance to hear these other speakers and these panels. I otherwise might not have known about the program here today. And I'm flattered that they asked me to try and do something about ethics here at the end of the program. Before I get started, I'll note first that I don't have slides because my plan was to react to what we'd heard today. So that's good news. You have one less PowerPoint presentation today. Second is a few disclosures. The first one is I want to thank the organizers for the gift of the MD degree. I think Dr. Felicia Cohen appreciates hers as well. But we are going to reject our gifts and not be biased in any way in our presentations today. We're both PhDs. At least I'll speak for myself. So I have a PhD. Second, okay, there's the other disclosure. Second, we're not asked to disclose whether we have a passion that might influence what we're talking about, and I'm very passionate about research ethics and the responsible conduct of what we do, and that could bias me in what I think is important and what I want to say. And finally, in terms of funding, my funding was not listed. I do have NIH funding, as mentioned now, but I think it's on the order of $350,000 for current NIH grant, which did not end up in your disclosures. But I also receive salary for continuing to do what I do in the university, and so I have another vested interest in what I'm talking about. So having said that, one of the things that I've learned is that good ethics begins with good facts. And if we look at what we've talked about today, very beginning, Dr. Cohen talked about different kinds of ethical theories. And even though the speakers did not explicitly reference those theories as they spoke, we heard reminiscent pieces of all those kinds of approaches to ethics as we went through this. Everything from responsibilities of individuals and duties and consideration of what we would want, how we would want everyone to act, to consequentialist approaches, thinking what kinds of ends do we want to see in this process. But all of those theories are based on a premise that we're trying to figure out how best to do the right thing. How do we decrease the amount of harm or risk, and how do we increase the benefits that might occur? And so as I look through the talks today, I sort of created a framework that I will call the bias pipeline that I think helps us to identify where the risks and harms are that lead to potential problems for public health, for how we treat the very people that hopefully we are doing all of this for. And so there are 7 steps in this bias pipeline. The first step is the choice of research area, which can be affected by how we are biased. And we heard a very explicit example of this, the difference between pediatric cancer studies and what we look at, and how money drives perhaps looking more at statins and drugs that often are Me Too studies because there's more money there. The second is the choice of research approach. Dr. Kane had a very nice slide that showed a variety of ways in which people can choose to do their study in order to get the positive finding they want to see. I saw this personally in my own research as a neuropharmacologist and neurophysiologist, where we could choose the time points we want to look at to get the effect we wanted to see. Third, recruitment of subjects. So how do we decide who's going to be in a study? And I was reminded today that there are risks in both directions. There are risks of not including people specifically so that we can get a positive finding because we think that some people are less likely to show a positive result. And risks of including people who shouldn't be included. There was no reference today to one of the classic conflict of interest cases in this country of Jesse Gelsinger, a young man who was recruited and included in a clinical trial that ended up dying. And an argument can be made was that there was enough pressure because of the desire to get the trials to work, to bring people into the trials, that Jesse was recruited into the trial and included when he shouldn't have been. Number 4, the selection of data. And we've heard about examples of this as well today from a variety of speakers. Which data will be included, which experiments will we use, what kinds of endpoints will we choose, whether we choosing the right endpoints for that process. Again, always looking for things that will show the positive result we'd like to see. Fifth, number 5, selective publication. Not everything gets published, and unfortunately there are a variety of mechanisms that drive us to force us to not end up not being able to see everything that's been done. We lose out on some of the negative findings. We lose out on the findings that might show things were problematic or perhaps toxic. Those first 5 are all research areas, research-driven, and that's an important theme for what I'll come back to at the end. But as we move on, now we start to move towards the clinical end of things, which is mixed in as well today, between the research and the clinical end. The drugs or devices need to eventually be reviewed and approved, and we heard a good example of how that can be biased as well. Reviewers in that process, we want the experts, we want the people who know how these things work, but often they have financial vested interests in what's done. 7th, once we have an approval, there's a marketing and a continuing medical education process that can often drive choices about what will be used, not because of the merits of a product, but because of the right publicity. And sort of in a sense of disclosure, I've mentioned to Drs. Gupta and Rosen that my wife is a science writer, and one of her first science writing gigs was with a company that does writing for drug companies, basically helping prepare materials for websites, for publications, for continuing medical education. And in that process, the good news that we can hear is that people like my wife wanted to draw the line when things were going to be distorted. But also, one of her colleagues used to say, thank God for the FDA, because they could always refer to the FDA as perhaps watching over some of what was being done to try and prevent it, or at least prevent or mitigate some of the damage that might be done by misleading potential readers or users of the material. And then finally, at the end of all of those 7 items, we have patient care, which hopefully will be the best possible. What I think is remarkable, given what we've heard today in those 7 areas where problems can occur, it's remarkable that anything works at all. I look at this process and I can't imagine anything making it through that leaky pipeline, and apparently it does. And it does because, for the most part, scientists and clinicians have chosen their career paths because this is important to them. This is something they want to do well with. And as a result, we are protected by the very people that are part of that process. So with those items, I'm going to do a couple of ways of closing up now. One is to talk a bit about conflicts, to put in context what we've heard, because there are some pieces here we've heard a number of different ways. And one piece that has not been, I think, explicitly stated by anyone is we need to remember that having a conflict is not misconduct. We all have conflicts. We have conflicts all of the time. Some of them are financial, some of them are otherwise, but just because we have that conflict does not mean we have done something wrong. Having said that, I've just pointed out that some of those conflicts are financial, which we focused on a great deal today, but there are many other kinds of conflicts that can cause us to be biased. Third, it isn't just a matter of whether those conflicts will result in problems and actually will have resulted in problems. The question is whether there'll be a perception of problems. And this is one other anecdote that I will throw out that I think is important for this meeting. One of my best friends and colleagues in the research ethics field is a man named Francis Crina. He's the vice president for research at Virginia Commonwealth University, but he's also the author of one of the most widely used texts for teaching research ethics in the country. The book is called Scientific Integrity. Frank, I know personally as being one of the people who has the highest standards in his conduct of anybody I know. Some of you may know that name from a story in the New York Times of about 4 weeks ago that described how Frank Macrina, as Vice President for Research, had decided to ignore university guidelines and ignore all proper standards of scientific conduct and engage in a contract with Philip Morris Tobacco in order to receive on the order of $286,000, I believe it was, of funding for research projects at Virginia Commonwealth University. The perception in that story, especially on the front page of the New York Times, is not good. I know a great deal from behind the scenes from talking to Frank and from reading some other sources that this story looks far worse than it is. But the lesson is that perception can be far worse than even the reality. And so as we decide whether we want to continue down these paths, we should be thinking about not just whether we are good people and will do the right thing, but how might things be perceived. And finally, even when people are going to do things wrong, it's not just that they will intentionally do things wrong. It might be that they'll unintentionally do things wrong. So that's kind of what I've heard today. And I think from an ethics perspective, my job is to perhaps talk a little bit as my closing piece here about, so what should we do? We've heard a lot about disclosure as the answer, as disclosing what our financial interests are. We've heard a bit about management of that by having people observe what we're doing, independent observers, to make sure that even though we've got those financial conflicts, we won't do something wrong because of those financial conflicts. And we've heard a bit about the need for clear guidelines and policies and procedures, regulations from the government level. And I think all of these things are good and they will help. But if you think about that list I just went through of the wide range of ways in which we are at risk of bias in the process, these approaches are only going to solve a few of those. They're only going to focus on the financial. We can't ask people, we require people to start declaring if they have depression because they've written a paper about the genetic basis of depression. These are only going to work on the financial, and they're only going to work on some parts of the process. So what I would argue, that since it's only those financial issues, we need to keep in mind that the financial conflicts, as I said before, don't necessarily mean somebody will exhibit bias in what they do. And there are people who don't have financial conflicts who might have bias in what they do. So we need to do something more. We need to put our own houses in order. And I think the question we should ask is, how do we conduct our science? How do we conduct medicine or practice medicine? And in both cases, I think what we want to do is aim, and some speakers have alluded to this or referred to it, aim for greater transparency and tools to minimize bias as part of what we do automatically. So not just because of financial interests, which are probably always going to be there to some degree, but for any other risks of bias, that we'll find ways to minimize the chance that we'll report something that's untrue. As scientists, we are human beings, and we are at much risk of bias as anyone else. For 10 years, I taught a required statistics course in San Diego for neuroscience graduate students. One of the assays that I did with the students to teach them about statistics was to give them a piece of paper on which I'd drawn 2 lines labeled A and B. And I told them line A was slightly longer than line B, and to use a ruler, an objective measurement to measure those 2 lines so we could do a t-test and see how the t-test works. The students would do this every time I tried it. Every time we tried it, line A was statistically significantly longer than line B, just as predicted, even though line A was an exact duplicate of line B. It's not because neuroscience graduate students are particularly suspect and particularly subject to bias. It's because they're human beings, and we see what we want to see. If we want to see something positive, we'll find it. With those risks, we need to find a better way with the next generation of scientists, next generation of clinicians, so they'll be less likely to do these things, to accidentally or unintentionally bias their findings. So that will be done through teaching, through mentoring, and through modeling of what we do. Final sentence, or sentence or two, is I view all of this as suggesting to me that the academy is at risk. The greater the extent to which we engage industry and bring industry into our fold as a way to fund what we do, the greater the risk of misperceptions of what we do, but even more important, perhaps, for those who are looking at this practically, the greater the risk that what we have to sell will no longer have value. What we have to sell here is the idea that we are independent and objective. If we just become another arm of industry, there's no value here to be sold, and we will lose that funding as well. So to maintain that, we need to do what we can to keep the trust that we've heard we appear to have had in the past, but we're losing now. And we'll do that by doing a better job of training the next generation. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm so glad I asked you to summarize that. That was excellent, putting everything in context here.